In the sealed vault of the Philadelphia Historical Society, hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic silence, lies a record that no archivist dares to catalog. A confession, unsigned but unmistakably real, written in trembling script on brittle parchment, smuggled out of a prison wall, soaked in the scent of iron and rot. It tells of a family cloaked in piety, buried deep in Pennsylvania's soil, whose legacy is not one of worship, but of transformation, of flesh into sanctity. They were called the Whitmores. From 1745 to 1792, over 73 people vanished across religious communities in colonial America. Devout elders, wandering preachers, and orphaned children whose names were quickly forgotten. Most were posthumously canonized by local ministers, and their remains distributed as relics of great spiritual power. What no one dared admit, what the sealed testimony exposes, is that these relics weren't ancient European saints. They were neighbors, friends, children, disassembled behind the walls of a rural workshop, posing as a humble forge for God's glory. And behind it all stood the Whitmore family, respected, admired, and quietly feared. Tonight, I'm taking you into that house. Not the one built of timber and stone, the real house, the one made of lies wrapped in scripture, the one held together by blood, bone dust, and holy symbols scorched into the skin of innocence. We'll go room by room, secret by secret. We'll open the boxes they buried beneath chapels, and we will not look away. Because once you enter the Whitmore house, you don't leave unchanged. Let this be your warning. Not everything labeled holy is of heaven, and some saints never chose to be saints at all. Stay with me. Keep your eyes open. Don't flinch, because the farther we go, the more you'll start to realize this isn't just a story about one family. It's a blueprint for how power hides in the open, wearing robes, reciting prayers, performing rituals on altars soaked in silence. And the next relic they use to sanctify their institutions might be closer than you think. Welcome to the macabre history of the Whitmore family. They arrived from England under the guise of craftsmen, bearing holy purpose in their pockets and polished lies in their eyes. The Whitmore family settled in Chester County in 1742, a modest 12-acre patch of forested land nestled between wild hills and whispering trees. On paper, they were nothing more than pious artisans, makers of chalices, communion plates, and ornate boxes meant to carry scripture. But the locals never saw what lay beneath the surface. They never looked closely enough. Nathaniel Whitmore was the patriarch, stern, silver-eyed, hands stained from oak dust and iron polish. He spoke softly but moved like a man obeying divine instruction. His wife Elizabeth managed their 4 children with a kind of surgical detachment. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Her silences lasted just a little too long. The workshop was their altar, a timber structure with tall windows that poured sunlight onto a floor where more than metal was shaped. Ministers came often, ordering sacred vessels. They admired the craftsmanship, unaware of the rituals happening behind the canvas-covered door at the back of the shop. It was always locked. Only family entered. Only family knew. It started with Mary Collins, a 43-year-old widow with healing hands and a reputation for saintliness. Mary had tended to the sick without pay for years. One cold November evening in 1745, as snow threatened and shadows stretched across the forest path, Nathaniel lured her off the road. He said his son William had gone missing in the woods. He begged for help. She followed. She never returned. What followed was not slaughter. No, what they did was far more deliberate, far more reverent. They treated her body like scripture, cleaned, preserved, partitioned. Her flesh salted and sealed, her bones boxed, her organs placed within hand-stitched pouches embroidered with holy symbols. Nathaniel told his children they were giving her sanctity, that they were rescuing souls from death by turning them into objects of worship. He called it God's work. But you'll soon see it was something much older, something deeper, something that still slithers beneath stained glass and stone. By spring of 1746, Nathaniel Whitmore was no longer just a craftsman, he was a supplier of miracles. He returned from Philadelphia with something new in his eyes: confidence, authority. The Quaker meeting house had welcomed his handmade altar box with reverence. Inside, hidden beneath its base, was the first sacred relic, a fragment of Mary Collins. It was never questioned. How could it be? Nathaniel had spoken so movingly of her devotion, so passionately about her spiritual legacy. No one suspected that her flesh sanctified their altar. And then, the miracles began. In a small Episcopal church near the Delaware River, a woman who touched one of Nathaniel's relics, marketed as bone from a 12th century martyr, claimed her cancer vanished. Another said her fever broke after prayer beside the saint's heart. No one could trace these relics back to their origins. They were always imported, always mysterious, always sacred. But they weren't imported. They were harvested. The family's methods evolved quickly. Thomas, the eldest son, became Nathaniel's shadow, learning the alchemy of tissue preservation. William, the frail and unnerving youngest child, developed an obsession with anatomy. He spent hours in the woods dissecting animals. When the time came, he transferred those skills to human remains. Elizabeth designed the relics themselves: black velvet bags stitched with golden thread, silver reliquaries lined with crimson satin. She claimed God guided her hand. But her daughter Sarah would later write in a lost journal entry, "Mother's eyes no longer blinked when she sewed fingers into silk." It was not slaughter, it was ceremony, and the churches, they paid handsomely. By 1750, ministers from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland quietly competed for Nathaniel's creations. They didn't ask questions. They didn't want answers. All they wanted was the power to draw crowds, to perform miracles, to raise their status. Nathaniel gave them that power, and he asked only one thing in return: silence. You see, in a land torn between purity and ambition, the Whitmores understood something the churches dared not admit. Faith wasn't about truth, it was about utility, and the body, sanctified through ritual and silence, was the most powerful tool of all. They broke bread like any God-fearing family. Every Sunday evening, the Whitmores gathered at their heavy oak table, a velvet pouch placed silently in the center. It was never discussed, never touched during meals, but it was always there, a reminder. Nathaniel would offer prayer, not to a God in the sky, but to the system he had created. He praised providence, thanked divine purpose, and when his children opened their eyes, they were taught to believe their family's work served something higher. Thomas believed. Sarah obeyed. William watched. He watched everyone, every gesture, every reaction. He knew who hesitated, who flinched, who looked away, and he remembered. As the years passed, the family business flourished. Nathaniel hired new apprentices, poor boys, church orphans, sons of indebted farmers. They were taught woodworking and metalcraft, but they never saw the cellar, never questioned the sounds beneath the floorboards after sunset, and when one asked too many questions, he was dismissed and never seen again. The Whitmores were no longer just artisans. They were curators of sacred flesh. What the public saw was prestige. Church leaders from as far as Virginia visited the Whitmore workshop, commissioning ornate containers, golden crucifixes, intricately engraved communion plates. Each one, secretly fitted with compartments no one but the buyer knew existed. Inside, pieces of saints. Outside, piety. Inside, silence. The most disturbing part? It worked. The relics performed. Whether through faith, fear, or psychosomatic power, people healed. Congregations grew. Donations poured in. And Nathaniel fed it, one sacrifice at a time. He told his children something that still echoes through the sealed manuscript. The Catholic Church controls Europe because it controls power, not truth. Power is ritual built from silence, and every institution that thrives feeds on the unspoken. The children didn't know whether to fear him or follow him, but they all agreed on one thing: Father never lied. He only said what no one else dared to. And now I'll say it to you, because once you hear it, you'll never see the world the same again. The cellar was never listed on the property deed. It wasn't part of the tour when ministers visited, nor mentioned in the town records. But it existed, dug deep into the clay under the workshop, supported by hand-hewn beams blackened from smoke and something older than smoke. This is where the real work happened. Stone tables, hooks, a drying rack, salted basins, the air thick with lye and camphor. This wasn't just a mortuary, it was an alchemical sanctum, a space engineered to strip away the illusion of death and refashion it into divinity. Each body was treated not as a corpse, but as a resource. Their flesh became relics, their bones instruments of spiritual leverage, and each piece was categorized, labeled, and stored according to its intended effect: healing, prophecy, protection, wealth. The Whitmores claimed to discern spiritual qualities based on the virtue of the victim and how cleanly they died. It was Elizabeth who made that distinction. In Sarah's journal, she wrote, "Mother said the struggle stains the soul. If they go quietly, they ascend clean. If they fight, they rot too fast to be useful. They chose the quiet ones, the lonely, the devout, the forgotten, and sometimes the willing." You see, the Whitmores didn't always abduct their saints. Some offered themselves, persuaded by scripture twisted into servitude, told they were chosen to become vessels of God. They were bathed, blessed, and bled beneath the floorboards while hymns were sung upstairs. This wasn't madness, it was doctrine. The family believed they were building a new foundation for American faith, one rooted not in European idols, but in local sanctity. Saints made in the image of the people, saints who once walked among them. And the churches accepted the relics, again and again, because they worked. Miracles were profitable, and silence was safer. You might be wondering, why didn't anyone stop them? Because the institutions that benefited most had no interest in knowing the truth. And in America, just like in Rome, nothing kills faster than knowing too much. They weren't just carving relics, they were shipping them. By 1791, Nathaniel Whitmore had perfected the art of sacred export. Bundles labeled as ritual instruments were sealed in wax, stamped with a church crest, and sent downriver to cloisters from Boston to Baton Rouge. Some were mailed to mission stations deep in the frontier, where new settlers begged for divine protection from plague, madness, and rebellion. The recipients never asked what the relics were made of. They didn't care, because when the packages arrived, things happened. A crippled boy in Charleston walked again. A fire in a nunnery stopped inches before the altar. A Baptist elder's tumors vanished after placing the relic in his vestments. Word spread, quietly, through back channels, between whispers and confessionals. The Whitmores became myth. Some said God spoke through them. Others whispered they had made a pact with something far older than God. But it wasn't just churches anymore. Fraternal orders began requesting pieces, private societies, wealthy patrons of secretive sects who didn't want miracles. They wanted power, influence, immunity. Nathaniel obliged, for a price. It was Thomas who managed the business. His ledgers, discovered decades later in a crumbling attic behind a false wall, listed the initials of every buyer, date of transaction, and what was exchanged: relics for protection, bones for loyalty, blood for obedience. One name appeared 23 times, and the initials matched a man who later sat on the U.S. Supreme Court. But nothing in the ledger was more disturbing than the footnote on page 74. No product derived from kin. The line must remain unbroken. They never sacrificed their own. That was the line. But even lines blur when too much power is at stake, and the deeper the Whitmores went, the more reality distorted. Time bent. Visions crept into their minds. Visions had no longer felt like hallucinations. Sarah would wake screaming, her hands stained with dirt she hadn't touched. Elizabeth began humming hymns in Latin she never learned, and young William, the quietest of all, started sketching symbols, circles, limbs, spirals, over and over, even in his sleep. Because once you channel power through death, it starts whispering back. William Whitmore was the quiet one. While his mother and father orchestrated the sanctification of flesh and the export of holy relics, William sat in silence, withdrawn, watchful. He rarely spoke. He never cried. But when he began drawing, the family believed it was divine inspiration. At first they were harmless, crosses, doves, stars. But soon, the paper darkened. He began sketching shapes no one recognized, complex spirals encircling dismembered limbs, eyes where eyes shouldn't be, mouths sewn shut, altars with creatures crouched on all fours. Each drawing was more frantic than the last, as if pulled from a nightmare that returned nightly. Elizabeth believed he was chosen. She preserved each piece in glass, labeled them like scripture, said William was receiving messages from saints, too ancient for human language. But Thomas wasn't so sure. He found the boy speaking to the walls, laughing when no one else was present, and sometimes William's hands moved even while he slept, etching onto the floorboards with shards of glass pulled from windows he'd shattered himself. The house began to change. Candles went out without warning. Bible pages blackened at the edges, cold spots formed in the stairwell, ice-cold pockets where breath became visible even in summer. William grew pale. His gums bled. He refused food, then began asking for the broth, a mixture Sarah claimed was used only for ritual fasting. It smelled of rust and root rot. Then the dreams began to spread. Thomas woke to find Elizabeth standing over him, her eyes rolled back, whispering in that same unlearned Latin. Sarah was found in the yard, naked and digging a pit with her bare hands, and one night, a visitor, a minister from Maryland, fled the house mid-sermon, shrieking that something had touched his spine through the floor. They sealed William's room, bricked it shut from the outside. And still, on cold nights, neighbors claimed they heard scratching beneath the boards, and a voice whispering in a child's breathless tone, "You shouldn't have buried me where the dead don't sleep." Because William wasn't possessed, he was invited, and now, whatever spoke through him, wanted more. The ritual was not in any book, not in the scriptures, not in the Apocrypha, not even in the dark pages traded among Europe's forbidden libraries. It came to them in fragments, visions, scratches in the margins of William's drawings, half-spoken phrases from Sarah as she drifted between waking and trance. Thomas compiled them all, cross-referencing with Elizabeth's notes, until something ancient and sinister took shape. They called it the binding. The ceremony was meant to seal the gift, to trap the whispering power inside a single vessel and root the family's dominion across generations, not to worship, not to destroy, but to tether the entity, to own it. And it required blood, but not just any blood. The Whitmores had a rule: no product derived from kin. A rule Thomas, in desperation, chose to break. On the cold night of November 11th, 1793, the family gathered beneath the house, in a chamber none outside the bloodline had seen. Carved from stone, the walls were inscribed with spirals and open eyes. Candles flickered in unison, though no wind stirred. William lay on the altar, calm, smiling. He wanted this. Sarah wept openly, clutching the book of impressions, an heirloom no scholar had ever decoded. Elizabeth recited the incantation in a tongue that vibrated the very air, and Thomas, trembling, drew the blade, not to kill, but to open. As William bled into the basin carved in the altar's center, the walls began to shift, not physically, but visually. Patterns twisted. The floor seemed to stretch. The candle flames leaned inward, as if drawn by breath. Then a sound filled the chamber, low and full, like the groan of the earth beneath centuries. And a figure emerged in the flame. Not man, not beast, a thing between, antlers of bone, eyes like holes punched in fabric, a mouth that never moved, yet poured forth a voice. You offer, I accept, but the child is mine. Elizabeth screamed, Sarah collapsed, and Thomas, too far gone in faith or madness, simply whispered, so be it. The binding was complete, but William never spoke again, because what stood now within his shell was no longer a child. After the ritual, the town changed. Not overnight, but with the quiet, spreading rot of something deeply infected. The fields began to fail, first with blight, then with silence. No birds, no insects, no wind. The church bell stopped ringing, and those who stayed too long near the Whitmore estate complained of headaches, then fever, then visions. Children were the first to speak of it. They said the boy with no name walked the streets at dusk, that he didn't blink, that when he looked at you, you couldn't move, not out of fear, but because something inside you wanted to follow him. He had William's face, but not his soul. Sarah became bedridden, speaking only in symbols. Elizabeth refused to leave the house, claiming the angels had changed their faces. And Thomas grew cruel. He told the townspeople the land was cursed, but that the family could protect them for a price. He began collecting offerings, livestock, jewelry, sometimes children, for the preservation of divine order. No one dared question it. Those who did vanished or returned hollow-eyed, muttering scripture that didn't exist. Then came the harvest year. A dozen townsfolk disappeared, all of them young, all of them last seen near the old orchard bordering the Whitmore estate. By the time the town's doctor raised alarm, he found his home ransacked, his instruments melted, and his notes soaked in something that smelled like sulfur and ash. That winter, the snow came early and stayed. Entire homes were buried to the chimney, roads vanished, food spoiled before it could be cooked, and through it all, the boy, William, or what now wore him, walked barefoot across the drifts, leaving no prints, whispering into locked doors at midnight. It's almost time. Those who answered, never seen again. Eventually, the town did what desperate villages always do. They tried to burn it. The Whitmore estate was set ablaze by a drunken, terrified mob, but the fire never spread past the fence. The house groaned, smoked, then stood untouched by dawn. One man swore he saw something in the attic that night, a towering shape with limbs like branches and a mouth full of children's teeth. Whatever they summoned didn't want worship. It wanted roots, and they had planted them in the heart of Virginia. In the spring of 1847, the ground finally thawed, and with it, the secrets buried beneath it. A group of boys searching for firewood in the woods behind the Whitmore orchard stumbled upon something so grotesque it shattered what little sanity remained in that town. A shallow pit, no deeper than a foot. Inside, hundreds of baby teeth, no skulls, no bones, just teeth, tiny, pearlescent, arranged in concentric spirals like a ritual glyph. In the center, the head of a porcelain doll, its eyes gouged out and its lips stitched shut with human hair. The sheriff, a man named Clive Rowley, insisted the find be kept quiet. He feared mass panic. He feared something else, too, because that very night, after sealing the pit and stationing 2 men to guard it, he was found hanging from the church rafters with his jaw missing. His suicide note was written in blood. It read only, "He calls from underneath." The next week, 3 more children disappeared. And a traveling preacher, Reverend Hartman, arrived in town after claiming God had led him there through dreams of thorns and fire. He visited the estate, met Elizabeth, who had not spoken a word in over a year, and in that house, beneath the floorboards, he found the book. Bound in deerskin, written in an untraceable language. He would later describe it as a gospel not of light, but of the womb, the hollow before creation, where teeth form before flesh. He burned it, but the burning only summoned them. That night, screams echoed from the Whitmore estate that could be heard across 3 counties. Farmers reported seeing a swarm of black birds fly backward over their fields, and the river turned the color of milk. By morning, the preacher was gone. So was Elizabeth. And in the fields, 7 more spirals of baby teeth, larger this time, stretching toward the town like fingers. Whatever Thomas Whitmore had done, whatever. Sarah had birthed whatever William had become. It wasn't done growing. And the land now remembered. It remembered blood. It remembered bone. And above all, it remembered names. Because this wasn't possession, it was inheritance. Beneath the Whitmore estate was a cellar, no map recorded. It wasn't for food. Not anymore. It was for containment. A single door, iron-bound and padlocked. No hinges. Only drag marks where it had been sealed by force. When it was finally breached in 1907 during the estate's government seizure, the men who entered didn't speak for the rest of their lives. One turned his shotgun on himself 3 days later. Another had to be restrained after carving spirals into his own chest with a horseshoe. What they saw down there was not empty. There were remnants. Chains bolted into the floor, smeared with dark, flaking stains. A wooden high chair, massive, like something built for a child much older than any infant. The tray was etched with dozens of names, some crossed out, others carved over and over until the wood splintered. On one shelf, a row of mason jars. Inside each, suspended in brine, were tongues. Human, infant-sized, labeled only with dates and one word, returned, and the smell of milk turned sour and something far older, clung to the air like a breath that hadn't left in decades. The back wall of the cellar was damp stone, but in the center, scratched deep into the rock, was a single sentence. He speaks from the teeth. Investigators found claw marks on the inside of the door, some from fingernails, some not. It was Thomas who'd built it. Not out of cruelty, but out of desperation, because Sarah had given birth again, and again, and again. But the children weren't right. They came without eyes, with too many ribs, with skin that peeled in the moonlight. They never cried, only hissed, and when they started speaking in voices that were not theirs, he dragged them here. He prayed, he begged, he read scripture until blood leaked from his eyes, but they only laughed until one by one they died. All except the last. She lived, And what she became was not a daughter, but a vessel, a root of whatever ancient blight had taken hold beneath their land. Her name was Abigail, and her story, her reign, was just beginning. By 1899, the house had gone silent. The Whitmores had stopped inviting clergy. The neighbors, those who still lived nearby, reported strange echoes from the estate. Humming that never ceased. The scent of burning milk and wet iron wafted into the valley, even when no smoke rose. Inside the home, Abigail Whitmore had taken control. She wasn't a child anymore. She was 17, but had stopped aging. Her skin had the pallor of a wax doll, cold to the touch. She never blinked, never spoke unless alone, and when she did, her voice wasn't hers. Sarah, her mother, had become her caretaker, or, some whispered, her disciple. Journal entries from the time reveal, Sarah believed Abigail had become divine, not in metaphor, but literal transformation, that her bloodline had been perfected through sacrifice, and Abigail was now the embodiment of all Whitmore saints, an eternal being, a relic that breathed, and like any relic, she required worship and offerings. No longer satisfied with stolen orphans or secret births, Abigail demanded neighbors. The town records show 17 disappearances in 14 months. Always poor, always alone. The authorities did nothing. Why? Because the Whitmores paid them. And when Thomas, the patriarch, finally resisted, Sarah ended his life. Not in anger, but ritual. She burned him in the orchard, while Abigail wept black tears from the balcony. The ground turned soft where his ashes fell. 3 months later, apple trees grew twice as tall and bore fruit with no seeds. Abigail bit into one, and it bled. By the time a traveling priest finally entered the home in early 1901, every mirror had been covered, every window sealed with red wax, and the house was pulsing, breathing, witnesses claimed. He found Sarah collapsed in the parlor, eyes hollowed, tongue removed. Carved into her chest were the words, "She walks without a womb." He never found Abigail. But Saz, say he heard her, not upstairs, not in the cellar, but behind the walls, moving in silence, growing, feeding, waiting, because the house didn't need a family anymore. It had her. The house should have died with them, but it didn't. When authorities tried to seize the Whitmore estate in 1903, they found the house structurally sound, but resistant. Doors wouldn't stay unlocked. Measurements of the foundation changed by inches overnight. Surveyors claimed the house was repositioning itself. And something else. Their equipment failed near the root cellar. Compasses spun, candles sputtered, film refused to develop properly. One man fell through the rotted floor into what should have been solid earth, but instead found stairs, carved into rock, covered in claw marks. Descending too far, he climbed out delirious, screaming about the girl in the walls who kept saying, "You're not finished yet." They tried burning it, twice. But the house would not catch fire. The outer walls blackened, yes, but inside, the candles remained lit, the furniture unmoved. A cradle in the nursery rocked itself for hours, unaffected by smoke. So they abandoned it, let the forest take it. But still, the land would not rest. Animals avoided the area. Storms curved unnaturally to strike the estate. Pilgrims, people drawn by tales of miracles and martyrdom, began arriving again. They claimed visions, dreams, nightmares that directed them to the house. They didn't enter. They worshipped it, laid down on the ground, kissed the doorstep, left offerings, fingernails, locks of hair, bloodied handkerchiefs. One man cut off his tongue and left it in a porcelain bowl near the gate, and they all said the same thing. The girl told us to. But there was no girl. No one had seen Abigail in decades, and yet, sometimes, in photographs taken by explorers or vandals, a face appears, always in a high window, always pale, always smiling. No one ever sees it in the moment, only later, when the photos develop, and by then, if you look too long, her smile starts to widen. Then her eyes open, and you feel something inside you shift, like she's choosing you. The nursery was the heart of the house. At least, that's what the survivors claimed. In 1921, a group of 6 young spiritualists, inspired by the rising tide of seance culture, broke into the Whitmore estate with cameras, candles, and a Ouija board. They called themselves the Circle of the Womb. Only 3 came out, and none of them came back right. One had her hair turned white overnight. Another developed a phobia of windows so intense she had all of them sealed in her home. The third, the one who led the seance, cut off his own fingers 2 days later, muttering about 10 tiny witnesses. They all spoke of the same room, the nursery. Abandoned since the last Whitmore child died, if she ever really did, the room was untouched, toys still in place, a silver rattle engraved with AW resting on the windowsill, and in the crib, something wrapped in lace. They unwrapped it. It wasn't a doll. It wasn't human. It had bones, yes, and skin like candle wax, but no face, just a gaping mouth where the eyes should be. The board spelled one word, daughter. Then the walls began to shake. The door slammed shut, and the house whispered, not from within, but from below. All they remembered after that was waking in the woods, miles from the house, barefoot, blood on their hands. One held the silver rattle, but it was now scorched black. They tried to go public. No one believed them, until decades later, when an archivist found audio recordings from their seance. They were never aired, but those who listened said the final 30 seconds contained a voice not belonging to any of the group. A child's voice, speaking backwards. But when reversed, it said, "I am still sleeping, but soon I will be born again." And then, laughter, not from one child, but dozens, from the cradle, from the vents, from the walls, as if the house had raised a choir of the unborn. What does it take to resurrect a religion? Not faith, not even a god, only a body. And the Whitmores understood this better than any theologian. They weren't building churches, they were cultivating incarnations. Every altar they consecrated held the remains of a blessed child, what they called vessels. The body of a daughter who never truly died. Every few decades, the faithful would whisper of the return, a moment when the spirit sealed in the relic would stir and open its eyes in a new form. And the chosen mother? Always a Whitmore descendant, always unmarried, always selected by the house itself. In 1964, that mother was Eleanor Whitmore, a 17-year-old girl raised by silence and shadows, her lineage traced back to the first daughter, the one in the cradle, and the elders said her blood carried the proper memory. Eleanor vanished for 9 months, and when she returned, she held a baby girl, wrapped in scorched lace. The girl didn't cry. She didn't blink. She stared into people. They named her Seraphine. Witnesses said she aged strangely. Her hair grayed by age 6. Her teeth were adult-sized by 8. By 10, she stopped speaking English and only spoke in dead dialects of Aramaic and Old Latin. And she remembered things. People, places, events she could not possibly know. She told the pastor's wife about a fire in 1897 that no one alive remembered. She described a secret room behind the organ loft in the East Chapel, where the bones are singing. When officials searched it, they found precisely that. tiny skulls, dozens of them, each one engraved with a Whitmore seal. But Seraphine never admitted how she knew. She only smiled and said, "I've been here before, and I'm almost done remembering." That was the last thing she ever said before the fire. The chapel was burned to the ground 2 weeks later. No one ever found Seraphine's body, just the scorched lace, still warm. The fire was supposed to be the end, but with the Whitmores, there is no such thing as an end. There are only pauses between awakenings. In the months after the fire, something began to shift in the nearby towns. Children spoke of a girl standing outside their windows at night, always silent, always barefoot. She would tilt her head and whisper something only they could hear, and the next morning, those children would speak fluent Latin. One boy recited an entire sermon that hadn't been heard since the 18th century. He said it came to him in a dream. He said the girl told him, "Your tongue remembers." Soon after, 9 churches closed their doors permanently. Congregations dwindled, ministers fled. Several local priests left unsigned letters nailed to their altars that simply read, "She walks again." Investigators from Harrisburg arrived, eager to find a logical cause, a cult, a fugitive, maybe a mentally disturbed copycat. What they found were sealed basements, crawl spaces filled with bones, and in one church, buried beneath the baptismal font, a breathing cavity. It pulsed when touched, warm, organic, and then it stopped. When they returned the next day, it was gone. The Whitmore estate, meanwhile, stood abandoned, except it wasn't. Neighbors reported lights flickering behind boarded windows, a woman's voice humming hymns that hadn't been sung in centuries, a shadow pacing the attic floorboards. One boy dared to break in. He said he saw a mural on the ceiling, painted in human blood. It showed a tree growing from a ribcage, branches bearing eyeballs instead of fruit, and above it all, a girl with silver hair and black eyes, arms outstretched in crucifixion, mouth open in silent scream. The boy never spoke again. Just scribbles, page after page, always the same image, a girl in lace, surrounded by fire, smiling. The Whitmores didn't vanish. They became the foundation, and that foundation is still breathing, waiting. Because some saints don't rest in peace. They wait for the next womb, the next vessel, the next Whitmore. They said the rituals ended with the fire. They lied. What burned in 1792 was merely the first house, the outer shell. But the rituals, those continued underground, passed not just through whispers and bloodlines, but through documents, coded psalms, false catechisms slipped into hymnals across America. There are still congregations who believe they're worshiping Christ, but whose practices trace directly back to the Whitmores' heretical rites. They chant Latin phrases retranslated by Whitmore descendants. They anoint with oils laced with powdered bone, not frankincense. Their sacraments are inverted, replacing communion wine with blood, blessed in suffering. Most don't realize it. Some do. A leaked transcript from a private gathering in 1938, coded as a theological symposium, described a closed ceremony where a firstborn female of each family was crowned in silence, her name stripped, and her purpose consecrated as a living intercessor between worlds. They called her Vita Interius, the life inside. She would be placed in a hidden chamber beneath the chapel for 7 years, fed only scripture and vocal light. In 1945, a woman escaped one of these sanctums, her body scarred, her eyes lightless. She spoke only one sentence before vanishing from the hospital. She breathes through me now. Every few decades, a leak surfaces, a diary, a letter, a deathbed confession from a man who claims to have touched the original relic. They all describe the same thing: a moment of ecstasy and terror where time collapses and a presence, not God, not demon, enters them. It knows your pain, it feeds on your devotion, and it lives to be remembered. There's a reason so many churches look the same. The design wasn't just architectural, it was ritualistic. The vaulted ceilings, the arches, the hidden naves, these were conduits, antennae, cathedrals tuned to receive. And in the Sinister, a heart of them all, buried beneath pulpits and altars, Whitmore blood, not metaphorically, literally, sanctified, extracted, stored, because the rituals aren't reenactments, they're maintenance. The question was never what the Whitmores were, it was why they were never truly erased, because you don't erase something that's working. After the purge of 1792, a few survivors from the Whitmore bloodline vanished, names changed, estates sold under aliases, children scattered into adoptive church families. Yet by the 1830s, a new wave of church construction swept across the country, hundreds of near-identical buildings, all based on a design by a mysterious ecclesiastical architect known only as ELWW. That name appears nowhere in the official diocesan records, but in a sealed letter unearthed from the Missouri Synod vaults, one bishop confesses, "We kept him alive because he could speak the old name, not of God, but of whatever the Whitmores summoned and offered their children to." Across the country, the Whitmore design spread, not just as buildings, but as blueprints for control. From pulpit positioning to sermon cadence, every part of these institutions was engineered to open the same door again and again, until no one remembered the original key. But someone remembered. In 1971, a Vatican envoy visited 5 American dioceses in secret. His report, buried under Vatican-level clearance, stated, "There exists an American bloodline that believes itself chosen, not by Christ, but by something older. They do not pray, they activate." That's what the Whitmores became, not a family, but an activation protocol. You don't need the name anymore. You just need the pattern, the structure, the right pain, the right place, the right child. And when the right voices chant the forgotten syllables beneath the last echo of the choir, it breathes again. We don't know how many Whitmore churches are still active. Some were repurposed, some burned, but some, quiet, beautiful, filled with soft organ music, still draw in those who feel a pull they can't explain. If you're watching this and wondering, why does this sound like my church? Why does this feel like my family? Ask yourself this: have your ancestors ever disappeared into the choir and never come back the same? Because if so, you may already be part of the Whitmore resurrection, and you'll never even know when it begins, only when it ends.